All right, picking up where we left off, we have two more slides left, and this one is about education in mass society. So mass education is very much a product of mass society. In the later 19th century, the state's role in education increased significantly, and this also led to the further secularization of society. Now, education previously to this had been limited only to the wealthy elite, and in that context, usually only the sons of the wealthy elite. But by the 1870s, most Western European governments had some form of compulsory education. This was usually primary education between the ages of 6 to 12 for both boys and girls, and it was free. By 1900, there were more state-run schools with state-trained teachers, more of the standard public education we're used to seeing in the 20th century. However, girls continued to have less access to secondary education than boys, though schools for girls did continue to increase across Western Europe. However, these were private schools and families had to pay the cost. Still, many middle-class families supported education for their daughters because they saw education as a means of improving economic and also marriage prospects for their daughters. Now, what's interesting is that liberals and conservatives supported education. Liberals wanted moral and civil training for children based on secular values. They wanted to have secular education provided by the state rather than education provided by church, especially the Catholic Church. And conservatives were supportive of education because they wanted to improve military recruits and train people in social discipline. Also, as we will see, education was very convenient for developing nationalism. Education also supported the demand for skilled labor in the Second Industrial Revolution by providing more skilled workers for science and technology. But overall, the chief motive for the development of education in modern society is political. First of all, the expansion of voting rights and the expansion of universal male suffrage in the last decades of the 19th century required a more educated electorate. People needed to be able to read and understand political arguments if they were going to be expected to vote for different political parties. However, even more important than that, education instilled patriotism. It nationalized the masses. It indoctrinated children with a loyalty, with nationalism to support their state. Education also often standardized the use of a single national language, and education was key in the development of nationalism becoming the new faith for the people of Europe in the late 19th and early 20th century. Now, of course, education also contributed to an increase in literacy, and we see a rise in newspapers and magazines, especially in Western Europe. In fact, adult illiteracy was virtually erased in many Western European countries. Although men continued to have higher rates of literacy than women, people who lived in cities tended to be more literate than people who lived in the countryside, and of course, people in Western Europe were more literate than those in Eastern Europe. For example, by the year 1900, there was a 99% literacy rate in Germany, but only a 25% literacy rate in Russia. With this increased literacy rate, this led to a rise in the mass circulation of newspapers. And newspapers were written so that they were easily understandable and also tended to have more sensational stories so that people would buy and read those newspapers. Newspapers were also instrumental in the development of nationalism and mass politics, which we'll discuss more later. There also were we also see the emergence of more specialty magazines, magazines about different subjects, also geared towards women, geared towards leisure activities. But ultimately, literacy was a new product of the new mass culture that we see in this period. And so our last slide is sort of summarizing what life was like in the fin de siècle, which is the end of the century, and what was life like in this new mass society with mass culture, mass leisure, mass consumption? Well, at the beginning of the lecture, I mentioned this period known as La Belle Epoque, which is the sort of tail end of the 19th and into the 20th century before the start of World War I. The Belle Epoque period saw an increased standard of living in all the industrialized countries. Like I said, this was the golden age of European civilization. And Belle Epoque essentially means the good old days, as this period was sort of remembered as the good old days when everything was great, especially after World War I and the Depression that followed. However, it's important to remember that these better living conditions occurred more in Northern and Western Europe, such as Britain, France, and Germany, rather than Southern Europe or Eastern Europe. In Western Europe, in particular, people gradually enjoyed higher wages and the price of food declined. In Britain, wages almost doubled between 1850 and 1900, so that meant that people of many different social groups might have more money to spend on clothing. Also, meat consumption increased significantly. People were able to eat better food, a wider variety of food, and this is due to the invention of refrigerated railroad carts, ice boxes, and overall improved transportation. Now, with the Belle Epoque period and this increase in the standard of living, Europe will start to see the beginning of mass leisure. So mass leisure, leisure activities that many people could participate in. This was really a new concept, this idea of leisure, which was created by industrialization and the creation of a work week. And therefore, leisure became the opposite of what you did for work. It was what you did for fun, and it took place mostly in the evenings and the weekends. This meant people now participated in activities like taking a walk in the park or going to the beach, going to museums and opera houses. It was more than just frequenting the local tavern. People could also go to amusement parks and athletic events. Cafes and taverns and bars enjoyed increased patronage in cities and towns all across Western Europe. And transportation also increased the variety of leisure activities available. There were also many music and dance halls that emerged in the second half of the 19th century. You can think of these kind of like concert venues and dance clubs that were frequented by young people. In Paris, thousands of young people would attend these music and dance halls every week for a good time. Now, for the middle and upper classes, mass tourism also became a form of leisure. One of the first tour companies was a company called Thomas Cook in England, and it began organizing tours for the middle and upper class to visit different places in England or different places in Europe. So this also tells us that mass leisure is becoming business-based. Leisure changed from simple festivals and fairs in pre-industrial Europe, events that were more of a spontaneous community cooperative, whereas in industrial Europe, leisure became standardized for a passive mass audience, and leisure is organized into a business in order to make a profit. Now, a major component of this mass leisure was the development of sports and athletic opportunities. Sports attracted increased spectators as well as increased participants. So sports clubs grew significantly. These are like teams and things like that. Many competitive sports became more strictly organized with rules and officials. We saw the development of professional leagues and unions. And of course, these sports were mostly male-oriented. One of the most popular sports in Europe then and now is soccer, or what they call football, also rugby, and also bicycle races, horse races, car races, and track and field. In fact, in the 1890s, this huge bicycle craze swept Western Europe, and many members of the middle class would purchase bicycles and ride their bicycles during their leisure time. And As we will learn later, this bicycle craze has a serious effect on imperialism in Africa. Even increased numbers of women took part in bicycling and some sports clubs. In fact, women gradually abandoned the more restrictive clothing of the 19th century, things like corsets and whalebone skirts, for dresses that allowed more movement. But this emerging sports culture also mirrored the growth of aggressive nationalism in the late 19th century. In fact, some social Darwinists believed that sports competition confirmed the superiority of certain racial groups, and events like the Olympics seemed to encourage this type of competition. And sports also were intended to provide training for adolescents, especially adolescent men, to teach them teamwork and other necessary skills for military service. Mass leisure also led to the development of mass consumption, which is seen through the development of advertising and department stores and increased consumerism across Western Europe, because the improvement in the standard of living allowed for more spending. The development of the factory system and the assembly line allowed for the mass production of goods. Population growth led to increased demand for products, and expanded transportation systems allowed for movement of those goods and products to and from different areas. And then urbanization and the modernization of these cities allowed people to have more access to this consumerism. And so this led to the development of department stores, of more retail and shops, and opportunities for people to spend money on clothes and household goods and things like that. This also, of course, led to the development of advertising as a more complete industry. And advertising was usually directed towards middle-class women, as a lot of advertising is still directed towards women today. But advertising emerged with the growing consumerism of the late 19th century. So to wrap things up, the development of mass society that we have been talking about, which is essentially the standardization of society for the population so that everyone does the same thing, everyone thinks the same thing, everyone wants the same thing, eats the same thing, everyone does the same leisure activities. It's all about that standardization. And we still live in a mass society today, but this mass society is what leads to and supports the development of mass politics. So again, the development of this mass society with mass leisure, mass consumerism, mass culture, etc., 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 would coincide with the age of mass politics, which would include the development of political parties, nationalism, and increased competition between European countries, both within Europe and also abroad with imperialism. But that's another story for another day. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to complete your write-up.